Welcome to some very famous people you've never really heard of. Bite-sized biographies of the famous, the infamous, and the quirky in less than an hour. My name is Philip D. Gibbons, and there is more information about me, this podcast, and a bibliography at bitesizedbiographies.com. There are also photographs of many of the individuals and items mentioned in this podcast. At the conclusion of Part 2 of this presentation, there will be additional suggestions concerning further information about today's subject, F. Scott Fitzgerald. If you have enjoyed this presentation, please like us at our Facebook page, Bite-Sized Biographies. Subscribe to my YouTube page at Noblesse Oblige. Please note that all of Bite-Sized Biographies are now available on Spotify. And please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies. Now let's continue with our story about F. Scott Fitzgerald. This cycle continued in 1929, the 2-year lease expiring in Delaware in the spring, the Fitzgeralds heading back to France for more ballet lessons with Igorova. At least this time, Zelda contributed some stories that helped pay for the rather expensive lessons, which went for $300 a month. Living in Paris meant inevitable encounters with Hemingway, was already riding high after the tremendously positive response to The Sun Also Rises, and now having just completed his second substantive work, A Farewell to Arms, which would also be enthusiastically received. Fitzgerald was intent on providing an explicit critique of the manuscript, again providing specific advice via a lengthy written memo. But Hemingway outwardly felt he didn't need such guidance, despite eventually adopting some of the changes, and he also did not divulge his current Paris address to Fitzgerald. Ernest's now second wife, Pauline, did not wish to be disturbed by Fitzgerald's nocturnal drunken visits, and Hemingway was also tired of practically babysitting Scott when he was heavily drinking. It was also clear via the various incidents and even arrests for fighting and public drunkenness that Fitzgerald's alcohol abuse was ramping up to serious levels. While Hemingway and Fitzgerald remained cordial and occasionally corresponded as Hemingway's career took off and Fitzgerald's lost momentum, Scott practically withdrew from the relationship, upset by his lack of productivity and the realization that he was no longer the shining star of American literature. On October 29, 1929, the New York stock market crashed, a development that had no effect on Fitzgerald's personal finances as he spent most of his income and had never invested in any of the market's securities. But this development would eventually affect the Fitzgeralds' lives in ways that played out subtly in the course of the next few months and even years. A month before the stock market crash, Zelda received an invitation to join an Italian ballet company, a request that seemed to push her to the limit of mental and physical endurance as she prepared to try to appear with this company. Fitzgerald eventually talked her out of appearing, but she began acting out in destructive ways, once attempting to seize the wheel of an automobile Scott was driving in an attempt to plunge the entire family down a mountainside. She then entered several clinics and by 1930 was in a psychiatric sanitarium in Pranjane, Switzerland, diagnosed with schizophrenia. Fitzgerald stayed in the vicinity of Zelda's various clinics and even brought his daughter to Switzerland for Scotty's 1930-31 Christmas vacation, but he also needed to return to the United States for the funeral of his father, who died in January 1931. Scott then went to Montgomery, Alabama, to discuss Zelda's condition with her parents, attempting to reassure them that he was able to take care of both his wife and daughter. How they reacted is not known, and they were probably not very receptive, believing that Fitzgerald's alcoholism was the main root of the problem. Zelda left her Pranjane sanitarium in September 1931. From there, the Fitzgeralds immediately sailed to the United States, intent on living in Montgomery to give Zelda a calm environment in proximity to her family, especially her father, whose health was in decline. In November, MGM offered Scott first $750 and then $1,200 a week to punch up a Jean Harlow project entitled The Red-Headed Woman. Fitzgerald ran into trouble immediately as a result of the studio system of assigning two writers to a script. Scott, uncomfortable with his collaborator, Marcel Desano, an industry veteran who delighted in changing just about everything Fitzgerald wrote, inclined to demand a personal meeting with MGM's all-powerful head of production, Irving Thalberg, to request that he get to work alone. Scott was told that this was a very bad idea. He also got word from back home that, in his absence, Judge Sayre passed away. Shortly after receiving this news, the Fitzgerald-Desano version was personally nixed by Thalberg as way too racy, and another MGM veteran, Anita Luce, was brought in, delivering a terrific comedy script, which was exactly what Thalberg originally intended. Fitzgerald left Hollywood after his 5-week contract expired. The legend that he was fired for drunken antics at a Sunday afternoon party at the Thalberg home may also have had something to do with his quick turnaround back to Alabama. Fitzgerald still got his $6,000, which he, as always, desperately needed. Probably wanting to get away from what must have been an oppressive atmosphere in Montgomery, he took Zelda to St. Petersburg, Florida, in the hopes that this environment might cheer her up. First as a form of therapy in Switzerland, and now as a formal undertaking, Zelda was hard at work on her own novel, and this effort contributed to a deteriorating mental condition that Scott could not handle, and Zelda herself demanded to be hospitalized. With Switzerland out of the question, in February 1932, Fitzgerald placed her in the Henry Phipps Psychiatric Clinic at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore. Scott then returned to Alabama. Scotty enrolled in private school in Montgomery, Fitzgerald attempting to spend more quality time with his daughter, who had either been shunted off to grandparents or private schools. Back in Baltimore, Zelda, her fiction writing still considered therapy, declared her novel finished. Without telling Scott, she sent it off to Max Perkins, who might have had some inkling that Zelda was writing a novel, but certainly was not expecting a lengthy, unannounced manuscript. Zelda then sent a copy of the manuscript to Scott, who was immediately shocked to find out that much of the material of his impending novel was now already a part of Zelda's work. He quickly sent a wire to Perkins imploring him not to even read the novel until the editor received some forthcoming revisions. Zelda, even in her current state, must have realized that she had overstepped some professional boundaries. She sent Scott a letter asking for forgiveness and explaining that she didn't want to trouble him with spending time on her manuscript while he was trying to finish his own work, and professed that she loved him more than anything on earth. She did not and would not apologize for including autobiographical aspects in her fiction, insisting that their mutual experiences were fair game. At the end of March, Fitzgerald headed back to Baltimore to help Zelda with revisions. Perkins had the revised manuscript by mid-May, and the work entitled Save Me the Waltz was scheduled for release in the fall of 1932. Fitzgerald seems to have come around to the idea of his wife publishing a novel, assuming it might, at the very least, generate some cash. Zelda was eventually partially released from the clinic, and needing to return to Baltimore for scheduled treatment, the couple rented a large Victorian home on 28 acres in Towson, Maryland. Fitzgerald, not wanting to have to relinquish even more material to any future fictional undertakings by Zelda, encouraged her to resume painting instead, which she did begrudgingly. Fitzgerald was still regularly publishing in the Post, but they cut his fees, affected by shrinking Depression revenues, but also complaining to Ober that Fitzgerald's latest efforts were not as compelling as previous material. Fitzgerald himself began to show the effects of dissipation, hospitalized for the first time in August of 1932 with inactive tuberculosis. On top of his alcohol consumption, Scott was also a chain smoker, a combination that would start to have grave health implications. Scott made attempts at various points later in his life to abstain from alcohol, but these efforts were always temporary or accompanied by his continuation through the consumption of beer. rumored to be as many as 40 in a day. October brought the release of Save Me the Waltz, Scribner's producing a modest first edition of 3,000 copies. Critics were brutal. They even attacked Perkins for releasing such a poorly edited and practically incoherent work. The former certainly a fair criticism in that the book contained numerous typographical errors. Zelda's over-the-top descriptive style was perceived as an attempt to emulate her husband's technique, an attempt dismissed as a practically laughable failure. Fitzgerald asked Perkins to include in Zelda's contract a provision that royalties generated by Save Me the Waltz could be used to defray the debt Scott had run up with advances he personally borrowed against future publications. He should not have bothered. The book sold only 1,400 copies and generated royalties of $120.73. It seems likely that Max Perkins, understanding Zelda Fitzgerald's current mental state and wanting to encourage Scott, published Save Me the Waltz as a favor to both of these troubled individuals. Following this fiasco, Fitzgerald again attempted to get serious about his own novel. He began to completely jettison large amounts of his previously completed work, unhappy with a story that revolved around a son killing his mother. Some of the plot and characters of what eventually became Tender as the Night began to solidify, but as the fall of 1932 approached, Scott was still a long way off from this manuscript's completion, and Zelda's condition and treatment did little to enhance his creative process. His wife's doctors made it plain that they felt that Zelda would never be cured until Fitzgerald quit drinking, and that he was also in need of psychiatric care. Fitzgerald scoffed at such an idea, responding that such treatment would alter his mind in a way that would remove his artistic talent, and alcohol was a necessary part of his regimen, rationalizations which satisfied Scott, if no one else. Zelda also began to withdraw from interaction with both her daughter and husband, behavior that only caused even more marital stress. Following the tumult over the failure of Zelda's novel, and the bitter battles over Scott's possessiveness concerning their joint experiences as solely his creative property, in late 1932, Fitzgerald was able to finally make extensive progress on his next novel, Tender as the Night. The story finally centered around a glamorous American couple that moves to the French Riviera, interactions with other American expats, and the struggles the husband has with alcoholism, the wife with mental illness. Although the main characters have been described as fictionalized versions of the Gerald Murphys, the story consists of composites of various different individuals, and the plot line frequently involves incidents and perspectives that were autobiographical, underlining why Scott was so sensitive about Zelda's use of such material. As always, Fitzgerald's sudden burst of energy emanated from one overriding concern: money. Although he was able to sell some short pieces, he resorted to another advance from Scribner's for a 1933 annual income of a little over $16,000, a far cry from previous years and indicative of a waning interest in even his shorter material. Fitzgerald also sold pre-publication serial rights to Tender as the Night's to Scribner's magazine for $10,000. Although he could have gotten more from less prestigious magazines, he reasoned that serialization in such a high-profile literary periodical could jumpstart sales of the subsequently published book itself. By late October 1933, the serialized version of the book was completed and delivered to Perkins in New York. Scribner's magazine promptly published the first of 4 installments in January 1934. The book itself appeared on April 12, 1934. Historically, it is usually described as being poorly received. However, its first edition of 7,600 copies sold out, as did 2 other similar editions. Although barely, it did crack the bestseller list in April and May. Critics were lukewarm, but the prevailing public sentiment was that in the Depression, tales rooted in the 20s of the problems of the idle rich on the Riviera were now not only irrelevant, but insensitive to nationally pervasive economic desperation. Although contrarian opinions do mention that the best-selling book of the year was Goodbye, Mr. Chips, an account of a schoolmaster of a British boarding school, not exactly populist material, the public may have also tired of Fitzgerald personally. The lengthy gap between novels, the same plot lines, and the perception of Fitzgerald as the personification of the mindless overindulgence of the Jazz Age rendered him and his stories irrelevant anachronisms. The book also was not the career-rejuvenating boost that Fitzgerald was hoping for. Clearly, his bright star as one of America's literary luminaries was now faded, for Scott the ultimate disappointment. On top of his professional decline, Fitzgerald also had to deal with the gradual deterioration of Zelda's mental health. In February of 1934, she re-entered the Phipps Clinic at Johns Hopkins. When treatment there did little to improve her condition, Fitzgerald had her transferred to an extremely expensive sanitarium called Craig House in Beacon, New York, a small town north of the city near the Hudson River. Perhaps out of guilt, Scott organized an exhibition of her artwork at a small gallery run by a friend in New York City. Zelda's condition at this point was so precarious that she was let out of Craig House briefly for the opening, but then returned immediately to the asylum. Although 13 paintings and 18 drawings were exhibited, sales were minimal and generated a little over $300. With the expense of Craig House impractical for the long term, and Zelda deteriorating even further, Scott, in May of 1934, and Zelda in a catatonic state, placed her in the Shepherd and Enoch Pratt Mental Hospital near Baltimore. Fitzgerald was slowly coming to the realization that his domestic life was permanently shattered and he would never have a traditional relationship with his wife again. A frequently repeated quotation from his personal journal summed up the despair associated with this realization. "I lost my capacity for hoping on the little roads that led to Zelda's sanitarium." Fitzgerald exchanged a few letters with Hemingway concerning the latter's opinion of his latest work. Hemingway tossed him a few backhanded compliments, but essentially made it clear that he was not particularly enthusiastic. What was also clear was that Hemingway had replaced Scott as the best friend of Gerald and Sarah Murphy, although life was presenting some unfortunate circumstances to this couple as well. One of their children came down with tuberculosis, which prompted the Murphys' return in 1934 to the U.S. Gerald was forced to go back to work at Mark Cross. In 1935, another of their children came down with meningitis and died suddenly. The tubercular child, Patrick, also passing away in 1937. The Murphys remained in the New York area for the rest of their lives, and Gerald never painted again. Although Scott was paid about $5,000 in Tender is the Night royalties, that would only put a dent in the amount Fitzgerald already owed on advances from Scribner's and Harold Ober. Fitzgerald then resorted to falling back on the only option he had to make money, short fiction. Most likely out of desperation, he produced a historical fiction series based on a 9th century count named Philippe. After the stories made most of the usual rounds, only Red Book magazine agreed to publish 4 of the articles, and only at greatly reduced rates. It is generally agreed among critics and biographers that this is probably the worst material Fitzgerald ever published, some of the dialogue so poorly unrealistic it bordered on comedy. Red Book published the first 3 stories despite Fitzgerald also missing deadlines, but declined to publish the 4th. Scott soldiered on, selling 3 stories to the Saturday Evening Post for his usual fees, but again the editors warned Ober that the material was mediocre. Later that year, Fitzgerald was fortunate enough to develop a relationship with Arnold Gingrich, editor of Esquire magazine, a newly created male lifestyle periodical that had a reputation for sophisticated material. Gingrich was an enthusiastic devotee of Fitzgerald's work, and he published anything Scott sent him. The only problem was that Gingrich only paid a maximum of $250 per article. Despite this drawback, Scott and Gingrich developed a close professional relationship, especially when Scott began hitting the editor up for advances. One of the ways Fitzgerald was able to avoid spending a great deal of time on Esquire projects was to take some of Zelda's unpublished material and polish it up. At least Zelda got co-writing credit when several of these stories were published. Attempting to think up any additional avenues of income, Fitzgerald approached the dean of Princeton's English department, suggesting a university-sponsored, meaning paid, series of lectures on the business aspects of publishing fiction. He was politely but firmly rejected, Princeton officially ignoring him while he was alive. Figuring, following the publication of Tender is the Night, that the time was probably right for another collection of short stories, Max Perkins suggested that Fitzgerald compose a few new pieces of short fiction to include with previously published material. Released in March of 1935, the collection was entitled Taps at Reveille, but the price at $2.50 at the height of the Depression was a handicap, and the first edition of 5,000 copies did not sell out. Additionally, at this point, Perkins informed Fitzgerald that Scribner's would no longer advance him money against future manuscripts. Harold Ober also informed him that his reputation as unreliable and unable to meet deadlines was becoming a prevailing opinion among many magazine editors, and additionally suggested that he not communicate with said editors while drunk. Both Perkins and Ober were remarkably tolerant of Fitzgerald's issues, both domestic and alcoholic, but both probably realized that sugarcoating his situation and handing him more money would only further encourage him to dissipate whatever talent and ability he had left. To top it off, Scott began to get reports from her doctors that Zelda was now suicidal. In late 1935, Fitzgerald predictably and justifiably, considering the enormous financial and professional pressure he was under, went to tiny Hendersonville, North Carolina, and checked into a third-rate hotel. Gone were the days of the luxurious Riviera villas or coastal mansions. Scott was intent on not fiction, but personal essays about his career, his state of mind, and why he was experiencing such creative difficulty. His benefactor at Esquire, Gingrich, agreed to publish these essays, 3 in all, starting in February and ending in April of 1936. These essays stated in no uncertain terms that Fitzgerald was professionally and emotionally burnt out, and even physically struggling. The public and private response to this introspection was uniformly negative. Publicly, Fitzgerald's revelations confirmed what the literary community and readers already sensed, that Fitzgerald was no longer relevant and washed up. Privately, even his close friends remonstrated him for feeling sorry for himself, suggesting that instead of self-pity, he should at the very least pursue journalism with a newspaper position, or even write another novel about his current state, but selling out the last remnants of his literary dignity at bottom dollar for Esquire was not only unimaginative, it was lazy to the point of shameful. In April of 1936, Fitzgerald transferred Zelda to the Highland Hospital, a sanitarium in Asheville, North Carolina. He spent much of the rest of 1936 near Baltimore, caring for his mother, who did not have long to live and was residing in a Rockville, Maryland nursing home. Upon her death in September, Fitzgerald split the $45,000 estate with his sister. Even after receiving this money, he was forced to borrow against a life insurance policy to pay back Harold Ober, who was now also practically Scotty's parent, keeping an eye on her at her Connecticut boarding school and taking her in at his Scarsdale home over the holidays. Although Scott peppered her with frequent letters with advice and academic recommendations, he went long periods without any personal interaction, spending most of the time in Baltimore or near Zelda in North Carolina. Scott sold one story in 1936 to the Saturday Evening Post. His last, it ran in early February. The rest of his 1936 sales were to Esquire, 9 in total, which paid about the same amount of money, $2,000. Even worse, Hemingway publicly denigrated him in that same year in Esquire in his short story, The Snows of Kilimanjaro, when he stated he remembered poor Scott Fitzgerald and his romantic awe of them, and how he had started a story once that began, "The very rich are different from you and me," and how someone had said to Scott, "Yes, they have more money," but that was not humorous to Scott. He thought they were a special glamorous race, and when he found that they weren't, it wrecked him as much as any other thing that wrecked him. Fitzgerald was mortified and even wrote a mildly remonstrative letter to his formerly close compatriot, the two still exchanging occasional correspondence. Hemingway wrote him back, but was not at all conciliatory, indicating that Scott's recent self-pitying material made this description completely accurate. Fitzgerald got an even worse public humiliation when, on the occasion of his 40th birthday, he was interviewed by the New York Post's Michelle Mock at his latest hotel in Asheville, the Grove Park Inn. He was depicted as drunk, broke, utterly washed up, with a tenuous grip on reality. This description appeared on the front page on September 25th. Happy birthday, Scott. Fitzgerald's 1936 earnings were slightly over $10,000. He spent the holidays in a hospital sickbed and also drying out. In early 1937, his only sales were to Esquire. He was surviving on weekly loans from Ober that soon totaled $12,000. By the middle of the year, his liabilities included that $12,000 plus $1,100 to Perkins and $9,000 to Scribner's. He also owed close to $7,000 to Highland Hospital and regularly needed to pay tuition for Scotty's boarding school. Fitzgerald was desperate, which his next career move definitely underlined. A friend from his salad days of the 20s, Edwin Knopf, was now in a supervisory position in the story and screenwriting department at MGM Studios. Not wanting to sound too desperate, Fitzgerald implored Harold Ober to sound out Knopf on a screenwriting position at MGM. Fitzgerald came to New York to meet with Knopf. The interview really more about Knopf ascertaining what kind of shape the writer was in. Rumors of crack-ups and alcoholism fairly rampant. Knopf came away impressed enough to offer him a 6-month contract at $1,000 a week for 6 months, with an option to renew at $1,250 a month. Urban legend has Scott working for nickels and dimes in Hollywood at the end of his life. In fact, with regard to some of the other famous literary Hollywood screenwriters, Fitzgerald was paid quite well. MGM paid William Faulkner $500 a week in the early 30s. Warner Brothers even less in the 40s, $300 a week. Nathaniel West, who worked for less prestigious studios like Columbia, earned $250 to $350 a week, and an annual salary of $52,1937 would equal $1.2 million today. Even so, the traditional literary world looked down its nose at Hollywood writers as a bunch of Philistine hacks who had sold out any pretense of artistry. Unfortunately, Fitzgerald could no longer afford such pretensions. He took the long train ride to the West Coast, rented a modest suite at the high-profile Garden of Allah Apartments, and started at MGM on the 12th of July, 1937. He immediately was reminded of his status in the literary pecking order when he reluctantly attended a Los Angeles fundraiser organized by Hemingway to raise money for the Loyalist cause in the ongoing Spanish Civil War. After a presentation of the film The Spanish Earth, a reception took place at the home of Frederick March. Although Fitzgerald did appear at the after-party, he did not speak to Hemingway and sent him a congratulatory wire the next day. In his journal, he wrote of the occasion, "I talk with the authority of failure, earnest with the authority of success. We could never sit across from the table again." Other awkward interactions quickly followed. Formerly close, Dorothy Parker and Robert Benchley were thrilled to have Fitzgerald as part of the movie colony. Their enthusiasm dampened when Fitzgerald, determined this time to stay on the wagon, politely but firmly declined their invitations. Both individuals known for their serious drinking. He was given an office on the MGM lot in the Writers' Building. To those who had known him earlier in life, he seemed withdrawn, almost embarrassed about his current situation. He drank Coca-Cola profusely, possibly as a stimulant, possibly to replace the feeling of a drink in his hand. Writers were expected to put in a full 8 to 9 hour day, including lunch, and Fitzgerald was determined to make this Hollywood foray, his third, a successful and lucrative venture. Perceived as having a formally collegiate background, Fitzgerald was initially assigned to the Robert Taylor Maureen O'Sullivan vehicle, a Yank at Oxford. Scott only worked on the film for a few days. Most of his lines were either cut or changed. The film was a typical MGM comedy, a mid-level picture that the studio churned out regularly on a reasonable budget that generated a predictable profit. A Yank at Oxford is remembered today as the film that got Vivien Leigh recognized at MGM, and which ultimately led to her casting in Gone with the Wind. Of utmost importance to any writer working on the film, Fitzgerald did not receive a credit for his work, screen credits indicative of the contribution and productivity of any particular writer. But, only involved for a brief period of production, Fitzgerald would not have been expected to receive such an acknowledgement. Most likely because of his highly literary background, Fitzgerald was then assigned to work on the film adaptation of Eric Maria Remarque's novel Three Comrades, a prestigious project produced by studio heavyweight Joseph Mankiewicz. Fitzgerald was even able to work initially by himself. By September, he completed approximately two-thirds of a first draft. Mankiewicz was pleased with the results, and Fitzgerald took a week off to visit Zelda and Scotty in Charleston, South Carolina. Although his interaction with Zelda was pleasant enough, he had no plans to move his wife or daughter to California. Scotty was headed to Vassar in 1938, and it was mutually agreed that Zelda still required psychiatric treatment. Fitzgerald already had another ulterior motive for keeping his family at arm's length. Although he maintained his sobriety upon arriving in Hollywood, within days of settling in, he already was involved in a romantic relationship with a high-profile member of the Hollywood community. Sheila Graham was a second-tier gossip columnist that first crossed paths with Fitzgerald on July 14th at a party thrown for, of all things, her engagement to another man. This man returned to her native Great Britain, and although Fitzgerald and Sheila did not interact at her engagement party, they did run across each other again at a Screenwriters Guild event at the Ambassador Hotel. His cinematic opening line to her was, "I like you," and her response was, "I like you too." From that moment on, they were an item. She even met Scott's daughter when Scotty came to Los Angeles, although Fitzgerald cautioned Scotty not to mention her to Zelda. Although Graham reinvented herself as an upper-class Brit, her real name was Lily Scheel, the daughter of Ukrainian Jews, and she was raised in a London East End orphanage. After dabbling in British show business, she came to the U.S. and attempted a career as an entertainment gossip columnist, and by 1937 she was syndicated by the North American Newspaper Alliance with a daily column called Hollywood Today. Not as prominent as Luella Parsons or Hedda Hopper, she was still making a reasonably good living in Hollywood. As she and Fitzgerald got closer, she eventually emotionally told him the actual truth about her humble beginnings, frightened that he would subsequently reject her. But Fitzgerald, with plenty of skeletons in his own closet, remained unfazed by these revelations. Graham, not particularly sophisticated, in her early 30s in 1937 and living in Britain during Fitzgerald's heyday in the 20s, knew virtually nothing about Scott's career and early fame. She also had no idea that he was on the wagon and had major issues with alcohol. Unfortunately, it did not take long for Graham to witness Fitzgerald's drunken personality. Although close, Graham and Fitzgerald did not live together, so Scott could at least partially rationalize his adultery. And when Fitzgerald determined that Sheila had gone out on a date with another man and stayed out later than what he thought was appropriate, he got drunk. When he finally did get her on the phone, he was nasty and abusive, but it was so uncharacteristic that she let it slide. At the studio, despite Fitzgerald getting assigned a co-writer and Mankiewicz rewriting a lot of his dialogue, Three Comrades was finished by the end of the year, and the studio was happy with the finished product, especially when the film was critically acclaimed. Margaret Sullivan nominated for an Oscar, and the film winding up on many lists as one of the 10 best pictures of the year. Despite his misgivings about some of the changes and omissions of his suggestions, Fitzgerald received a screen credit, and his contract was renewed for 1 year at $1,250 a week. Fitzgerald's next assignment was developing a script derived from a short story entitled Infidelity. As the story as written was too racy for 1938 film mores, Fitzgerald was charged with producing from scratch a plot line and script about marital infidelity, a rather nebulous assignment. Again, he was working with a production unit helmed by Hunt Stromberg, perhaps the most accomplished and respected producer on the entire MGM lot. The script was intended as a vehicle for Joan Crawford, already known as being difficult and particular, so Fitzgerald had his work cut out for him. After working on the script for 4 months, in May of 1938, Fitzgerald had 104 pages, but no ending. An acceptable story for the inevitable censors nowhere in sight. Stromberg decided to move on, and the entire project was shelved. By then, Scott was living at a cottage on Malibu Beach, and to cheer him up, Sheila suggested that they throw a party to celebrate getting away from an assignment that he had soured on. Unfortunately, he began drinking at his own party and eventually began to get hostile and belligerent. Most likely, he was putting on a brave face over infidelity's cancellation. It was also during this time period that he was contacted by Ginevra King, who he had not communicated with in many years. Going through a divorce from her first husband, she just so happened to be passing through L.A. in the very near future, and would he like to get together? Fitzgerald agreed to the meeting at the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, but was obviously so uptight about it that he wrote to his daughter that he had never followed up with Ginevra because he wanted to keep all of his obsessive illusions about her intact. Predictably, the meeting was disastrous. Fitzgerald began pounding double gin and tonics and became predictably obnoxious. When Ginevra asked, probably coyly, if she was the inspiration for any of his characters, he shut her down by saying, "Which bitch do you think you are?" They did communicate by telephone again a few times during the remainder of King's visit to California, but after that, Fitzgerald never interacted with her again. A successful outcome with Stromberg coming off of the success of Three Comrades would have added great momentum to Scott's career. He did get another shot at working with Stromberg and was assigned to collaborate with one of the most accomplished and highly paid screenwriters at MGM, Donald Ogden Stewart, on an adaptation of Clare Boothe Luce's play The Women, a production that featured Norma Shearer, Rosalind Russell, Paulette Goddard, and Joan Crawford. The two men worked from May to October. In the end, it was decided that a feminine perspective was more appropriate, and Anita Luce was entitled to finish the job. With the onset of damp winter weather in November of 1938, Fitzgerald moved from Malibu to a guest house on the Encino estate of character actor Edward Everett Horton, a property known as Belly Acres. During this time period, he worked on a script about Marie Curie. The studio brass wanted the story to be mostly a romance, which Fitzgerald resisted in the 70-plus pages he turned in January 1939. With 3 weeks remaining on his contract and the studio needing to either pick up his $1,500 a week second option or let him go, the studio cut him loose. With 3 weeks to go on this current contract, perhaps to get him off of the lot, MGM loaned him to David O. Selznick to work on Gone with the Wind. He worked on polishing the dialogue and the script, but because Selznick was trying to get as many fresh eyes and writing ideas as possible, after the 3 weeks ended, Scott was let go and new writers were brought in. Fitzgerald tried to submit story ideas to MGM, many stemming from his own works, hoping to be hired to write the resulting screenplay, but now he was on the outside looking in, and these attempts went nowhere. Fitzgerald earned approximately $85,000 during his 18 months at MGM. He was able to pay back Harold Ober, all of Max Perkins' personal loans, and much of Scribner's advance balance. He was also up to date on Zelda's hospital fees and Scotty's Vassar tuition. But he had saved very little and was now unemployed. Other than screenwriting, he did not write or publish any other external fiction, a situation that he decided he wanted to change. Now resigned to freelancing, he had more time to formulate an idea for another novel, which he also decided would concern Hollywood. He and Sheila avoided large Hollywood gatherings, instead spending time at intimate dinner parties with the likes of Thomas Mann, S.J. Perelman, Nathaniel West, and his former MGM screenwriting co-worker Charles Brackett. For Sheila, who had never really had the opportunity to pursue a formal education, he developed an academic program called the College of One that required reading and discussion of classic literature, art, and the humanities, a literal 2-year course with Fitzgerald as personal tutor. Although he did not have a contract, Fitzgerald did have Harold Ober's Hollywood co-agent, H.N. Harold Swanson, in 1939, probably the top literary agent in Hollywood. Swanee, as he was known, quickly got Fitzgerald a deal for a Walter Wanger film from United Artists entitled Winter Carnival. It dealt with the Dartmouth Winter Carnival, and Scott's collaborator was Bud Schulberg, fresh out of Dartmouth himself. Schulberg was the son of Hollywood pioneer B.P. Schulberg and just beginning a Hollywood writing career that included On the Waterfront and A Face in the Crowd. Schulberg was utterly deferential to Fitzgerald, and they got little done, and Wanger eventually decided that they should all go to Dartmouth to get a better feel for the material. Fitzgerald was resistant, and probably as a form of protest, he went on a terrific bender, and he and Schulberg barely made it to Hanover, New Hampshire, missing several trains and stopping at bars along the way. Wanger took one look at both of them when they got there and fired them, Fitzgerald coming down with a 104-degree fever and winding up in a hospital in New York City. Schulberg would talk his way back onto the picture when Wanger got back to Hollywood, but Fitzgerald was through. By now focusing on the manuscript that eventually became The Last Tycoon, Fitzgerald hired a 23-year-old secretary named Frances Kroll, who actually became more of a personal assistant, helping Fitzgerald deal with all of the mundane aspects of getting through the day. Because no longer obligated to get out of bed and go to the studio, Fitzgerald began to drink heavily on a daily basis. One of Frances's responsibilities was disposing of the numerous empty gin bottles that Fitzgerald stockpiled in one of his bedroom drawers. But he insisted that he did not want her to merely throw them in the trash, concerned that his landlord, Horton, would become aware of his consumption. Instead, Frances would drive over to the Topanga Canyon and toss burlap bags filled with bottles into this deep gorge. Scott worked sporadically, and in April of 1939 he was drinking so heavily that he threatened to shoot Sheila Graham, who took the gun away from him, and suggested he shoot himself and that she hadn't any further interest in spending her time with a drunk. The next day, Fitzgerald left for North Carolina, picked up Zelda, and then proceeded to Cuba. Continuing to drink heavily, he left his wife in her Havana hotel room, her latest religious obsession compelling her to pray while he roamed the streets, eventually getting beaten up while attempting to stop a cockfight. With Zelda providing at least a modicum of adult supervision, the couple made it to New York, where they checked into the Algonquin Hotel. While Zelda went to visit her sister in Westchester County, Fitzgerald continued drinking. The bender ended with Fitzgerald's hospitalization in Bellevue's alcoholic ward, and then Doctors Hospital, where his tuberculosis was deemed active. Zelda made her way back to her North Carolina mental hospital on her own and would never see her husband again. After this adventure, Swanson placed Scott on a list of unavailable screenwriters, explaining that the writer was recuperating from an illness. In mid-1939, Fitzgerald did manage to grind out a sale to Collier's, but subsequent articles were rejected. Submissions to the Post were also rejected, and after a $500 advance, Ober informed Fitzgerald that he could not give him any more advance money. Max Perkins responding similarly when the inevitable requests for cash were forthcoming. Fitzgerald continued with a barrage of guilt trips that bordered on begging, this despite the fact that the Obers were already practically Scotty's surrogate parents. But neither man budged. Fitzgerald did reconcile with Graham, surprisingly, as he was still drinking. Most of what was left of his creative energy was focused on The Last Tycoon and his protagonist, Monroe Starr, fashioned after Irving Thalberg. In September 1939, he was hired by Sam Goldwyn, but lasted only a week after disagreements with co-workers. He spent much of the rest of the year trying to get various magazine and publishing entities, ranging from Scribner's to Collier's, interested in serializing The Last Tycoon. But most of these entities either felt the material was too caustic or were wary of fronting money without a completed manuscript. Fitzgerald's reputation for instability now widespread. He hit rock bottom with Graham again. When drunk, he became abusive and even sent her boss a wire, telling him that Graham's background was all a fraud and even revealing her real name. This time, Graham resolved to break it off for good, going so far as to destroying all of the signed first editions of Scott's books, ultimately a rather expensive method of venting rage. Once again swearing that he would get sober, she resumed seeing him. For the rest of 1940, now actually sober, Fitzgerald made progress on The Last Tycoon and survived on $250 checks from Esquire. He also battled both Zelda and the Sayre family over conditions concerning her release from Highland Hospital. The Sayres felt that she should leave. Fitzgerald claimed that he did not want to be responsible for her well-being and stipulated that he would remain opposed unless they got a divorce. The doctors at Highland ultimately made the decision to release Zelda into the care of her mother and fulfilled Scott's request to relieve him of any blame in the event of any relapse or harm that resulted from her discharge. Fitzgerald did get some work from an independent producer, Lester Cowan, on a development of his short story Babylon Revisited, earning about $5,000 on a treatment and subsequent script, but the film was never made. Cowan eventually sold the rights to MGM for $40,000. To escape the heat of the San Fernando Valley and possibly to save a few bucks, in May 1940, Fitzgerald moved into Central Hollywood, taking a $110 a month apartment on North Laurel Avenue, a block away from Sheila Graham's apartment on North Hayworth. Graham would describe their relationship for these last months as that of an old married couple. At the end of November 1940, Scott suffered a minor heart attack while at Schwab's drugstore. He was prescribed bed rest, was sober, but was taking Seconal as a sleep aid and Benzedrine in the morning. His apartment was situated on the third floor, so he and Graham decided that to avoid climbing stairs, he should move into her first floor flat that was literally around the corner. On Friday evening, December 20th, Fitzgerald suffered a dizzy spell and had to be propped up by Graham as he left the Pantages Theater after a movie. Scott told her he was concerned that anyone observing would think he had fallen off of the wagon. As he was scheduled to see the doctor the next day, he deferred medical treatment. On Saturday, with Sheila at her apartment, a football game on the radio, Fitzgerald suddenly stood up from his easy chair, grabbed the fireplace mantel with one hand, gasped, and then fell flat on his back. Graham, unable to revive him, got the apartment manager, but there was nothing to be done. F. Scott Fitzgerald was dead of a massive heart attack at age 44. One of the many urban legends about Scott at the time of his death was that his books were out of print when he died. Although untrue, his sales were minimal, and his last royalty check from Scribner's was for $13.13. A month before his death, Fitzgerald received an inscribed copy of Hemingway's latest novel, For Whom the Bell Tolls, which sold 270,000 copies in its first year alone. The author, the man Fitzgerald championed to Perkins after reading a thin, veritable chapbook, was now America's undisputed foremost literary superstar. After a viewing of the body at a California funeral home, Fitzgerald's casket was shipped back to Maryland for burial. He was denied a plot in the Catholic cemetery where his parents reposed, not as a result of his books being proscribed, but because he was not a practicing Catholic. 30 people attended his funeral at a non-sectarian Maryland cemetery, including Max Perkins, Harold Ober, and the Murphys, but neither Zelda or Sheila Graham, at the behest of Scotty, were there. Still in debt at the time of his death, Fitzgerald's only major asset was a $45,000 life insurance policy. When all was said and done, both his wife and daughter received a very small amount of money. Scotty borrowed from Perkins and Ober to finish at Vassar. Perkins was determined to salvage something from Fitzgerald's body of work, and in October of 1941, he published an unfinished version of The Last Tycoon, edited by Edmund Wilson, which also included several short stories, including The Diamond as Big as the Ritz. The edition sold reasonably well, and reviewers were deferential. How then did Fitzgerald's work return to the prominence and sales it eventually attained, especially in the latter half of the 20th century? During World War II, to assuage the incredible boredom that accompanied military service, a nonprofit organization comprised of some of the biggest names in American publishing coordinated an effort to mass-produce the newly invented paperback book for distribution to the American military. These books were designed to fit into the pockets of uniforms, and over 1,000 titles were produced, over 1 million copies printed, and sold to the government at a cost of about 6 cents a copy, including The Great Gatsby. 155,000 copies of Gatsby and A Diamond as Big as the Ritz were produced, and it became one of the most popular books in the series. GIs bringing their appreciation of Fitzgerald with them when they returned to the States. Fitzgerald's description of an era dominated by wealth and prosperity probably appealed to an entire generation yearning to create just such a new generation upon coming home. Critics were already reevaluating Fitzgerald's body of work, and the mass-market paperback greatly increased access to inexpensive editions of Scott's work. Although Zelda might have been aware of the first inklings of this revival of interest in her husband's catalog, she eventually added an additional note of tragedy to their ill-fated relationship. Having felt it necessary to return to Highland Hospital in 1947, on March 10, 1948, she was still in residence in a locked room awaiting her nightly sedative when a fire broke out, possibly arson set by an imbalanced hospital employee. She and 8 other patients died in the blaze. She was buried next to her husband until 1975, when the Catholic diocese, at the continued request of Scotty Fitzgerald, finally relented and allowed their burial together at the Fitzgerald family plot at St. Mary's Cemetery, Rockville, Maryland. Fitzgerald's epitaph is the final sentence from The Great Gatsby. To date, this book, a staple of high school curriculums nationwide and an American cultural icon, has sold an estimated 25 million copies. Thank you for listening to part 2 of this podcast about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Information for this podcast came from the books Some Sort of Epic Grandeur by Matthew Bruckley, Paradise Lost, A Life of F. Scott Fitzgerald by David S. Brown, and Crazy Sundays by Aaron Latham. There are also additional photographs, bibliographical, and musical information at bitesizebiographies.com. Thank you for listening, and please tell a friend about Bite-Sized Biographies.